Oh man, I'm like sweating underneath my shirt.
I'm wearing black.
Normally it's called a glass with Billy, so it's just gonna be our sweat.
Yeah.
안녕하세요. 여러분의 한국어 선생님 고빌리입니다. 오늘은 특별한 게스트를 모셔왔습니다. 누군지 궁금하시죠? 바로 덴마크에서 온 소희 씨입니다. 반갑습니다.
네, 반갑습니다. 안녕하세요, 여러분. 덴마크에서 온 소희입니다. 반갑습니다.
I brought her for a special reason though as well. That is because we're going to be talking about how you can improve your listening comprehension in Korean, and we prepared how many tips?
I think 9 or 10, probably 10 tips for
10
you
tips.
guys.
So what we're going to be talking about is not just how to improve your listening comprehension, but how you can get the most out of your listening comprehension resources.
Right.
And we're also going to be suggesting some specific resources that we would recommend for you to use for audio, video, and reading as well. I wonder if they could hear those cicadas in the background while we were
I don't know,
talking.
we have cicadas, which in Korean are memi. It's summer in Korea, if you can't see, we're sweating.
Yes. The first tip that we have prepared for you is...
Except that you're not going to understand everything from the very beginning. And be cool with that.
What?
Yeah.
But I wanted to speak Korean and understand 100% of what people are saying,
Oh,
always.
even Koreans don't do that most of the time, Billy.
But Koreans speak perfect Korean. Koreans can understand Korean dramas perfectly, right? 100%?
Yeah, well, they do, but sometimes don't you ever watch American dramas and think, what did they say there? Oh, I have to replay that, or I have to listen to that again.
Yeah.
They don't understand everything 100% all of the time. And especially you, as a Korean learner, you should be prepared to just accept that you won't understand everything from the get-go.
I started watching Better Call Saul. One of my friends was recommending it to me. And even in the first episode, a few things that one of the characters were saying, I had no clue what they said. Like I had to stop it and go back and turn on the English subtitles so I could hear it. And it's going to be the same with Korean. So just accept that you might not understand 100% of everything, but that if you can follow along and you get the gist of what they're saying and understand the expressions they're using, then that means you are understanding everything in that show.
Yeah.
The second tip is actually, I think, even more important than the first tip, and that is focus on...
There's a fly.
Focus on active listening over passive listening. But for people who don't know, what is active listening and what is passive listening?
I mean, active listening is when you're not only listening, but you're actually paying attention to, or maybe even taking notes, but definitely following what you're listening. Whereas passive listening is just if you have like the TV on in the background, you're sort of listening to something going on, but you're not really paying attention. So that's the same thing with Korean. Active listening is when you like decide to put something on and you listen to it and try to get the most out of that. Passive listening
So
is
if I'm just
passive.
watching a drama and I have it on kind of while I'm eating a bowl of ramen and talking with my friend on Discord or something like that.
Then that's passive listening for sure.
Okay, and then how effective would passive listening be?
Not very. I mean, there are some people that think that if you're just surrounded by something, you will sort of eventually absorb it. And if it's just passive listening, that's just not true. I think the best you can get from passive listening is sort of just tuning your ear to the sound of Korean. But don't expect to become fluent just from having it on in the background. It doesn't just like rub off when you're walking. Even if you walk in the street in Korea and listen to other people speak Korean, if you don't understand, if you're not making an effort to understand and to learn, you won't learn Korean. It's not going to help you very much.
So for passive learning, you're going to do a lot of that, whether you want to or not, if you're just interested in Korean. By doing active listening, you're going to just naturally get a lot of passive listening along with that.
Yeah.
And it's great, but don't make that your main type of listening.
Right.
And the third tip that we have for you for improving your listening practice is...
Comprehensible input. Try to find something that is comprehensible to you, something that you sort of understand, but that challenges you at the level that you're at. So, for example, if you're a complete beginner, you should start with some basics naturally.
Like watching the news.
No.
And medical dramas.
Definitely not. You want to learn the basics. You want to learn like how do you greet people? How do you say thank you? How do you order food? Like, how do you talk about your everyday life? Like something like that, right? Whereas if you're an advanced Korean learner who wants to continue to improve your Korean, this is where Billy's awesome suggestion comes in handy.
That's when you would watch a children's show like...
No. This is where Korean news comes in handy.
Okay.
This is where you want to watch maybe news programs on YouTube, or if you have access to a Korean news channel, you watch it on your TV. So it's really important to know your own level and be realistic about your own level. And not only where you're at, but where do you want to go?
But then there's something else that we should mention, and that is, what about kids level materials?
No. I mean, if
Why?
you, as a native English speaker, if you're learning, say, French or Spanish or even German, that may be the case, but Korean is just so completely different from the
Je
English
suis
language.
la grande musique. Did you have that in commercial?
In Korean, there are several levels of politeness, but if we just divide them into two grand sections, there is polite level and there's like familiar, like intimate level.
Yeah.
And children learn the intimate level first because this is what their parents will speak to
Right.
them.
If you watch a cartoon show, you're going to hear all the
Right.
characters are speaking casually, slaying with
Exactly.
each other.
So if you're a beginner and you want to learn with children's resources, you should be prepared to run into a lot of grammar that you just don't know. Vocabulary-wise also, there are a lot of things you may not actually find useful because a lot of things are about things you might find in nature or different types of animals.
Right. You
And
might not need to know the word for
Giraffe.
or hippopotamus.
Exactly.
When they don't even have them at the zoo.
No.
Like in Korea.
Do you know the word for hippopotamus?
Hama.
Hama. I don't think I ever said hippopotamus to anyone.
That's true. To be
Because
fair,
why would we
you're not
say
going
that?
around saying, "Wow, there's a hippopotamus over there."
Because there rarely is.
Yeah, and if you say that, it might be the last time you ever say it. So.
Right. So I think we just want to say like a word of caution if you're thinking that you might actually benefit from studying with children's books because they can seem quite daunting.
The next tip, whatever resources you're using, watch or listen to them multiple times.
Yeah, and you may even find that when you listen to it the second time, you will understand so much more because you already know kind of what it was about. So you can now focus on not following sort of the whole line of the thing you're listening to, or the story or the conversation, but you can focus on finding all the details, all the small expressions, or the new expressions or phrases you want to learn.
So then have you done that before?
Of course. I mean, when I was a kid, I used to watch Disney movies all the time, especially Cinderella. I would watch it on repeat. And I came to a point where I pretty much knew like every line. You spend twice the time, but your output is more than twice of listening at once.
The stuff you learned the first time will now support you to learn other stuff you weren't able to pick up.
Definitely.
I had that happen. I used to listen to a Sherlock Holmes. It was like a radio show where they had acting and everything. And it was the only radio show I had on my MP3 player. So I listened to that all the time, maybe for a month, every day going to and coming from work.
Right.
And the first time I listened to it, I got the gist of it, but not very much more. And by the time I had finished it, like, a month or two later, I was like really following along everything they were saying, like the style they were speaking. However, I will say though that there is a limit to this. Obviously, if you listen to something 100,000 times, it doesn't matter.
No. You don't want to do that. I mean, sometimes people talk about the 10,000 hours. You need 10,000 hours to really become good at something. But let's say you want to practice the piano. If you practice the same...
Should I play chopsticks 10,000 hours?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Doing that for 10,000 hours is not going to help you.
You're going to get
improve.
really good at playing chopsticks.
Yeah, but that's not eventually going to help you that much.
The fifth tip that we have for improving your listening comprehension is
writing down the words that you hear. So if you're listening to something and you hear some new words, try to write them down, because not only will it help you to visualize what the word looked like, but it will also help you to remember the word. If you write it down, especially if you write by hand, it significantly improves your retention of that word. So that's one thing.
I don't find a lot of people doing that though.
No, but I did it a lot when I learned Korean,
did
especially
too.
when I was a beginner. And I carried a notebook with me at all times that was specifically for writing
Yay,
down
another
new...
notebook carrier. Yeah,
I love
same.
notebooks. And I kept them. Did you
Yeah,
keep
I
all
still-
yours?
I still have all
I still
mine.
have them. Like
Yeah,
in
I
our
would
basement
go
storage
to the
here, I have
store
all my...
and-
But anyway, I find it so helpful, and it actually helps you track your progress as well, because when you then a year or two later go back to your old notebooks,
I remember when I learned this super basic word.
Exactly,
Yeah.
and it really helps you feel this sense of accomplishment, and you can really feel your progress in the language.
So then should I be writing down every single word that I hear out of everyone's mouth? Should I be, can you say that again?
No, you will never be able to finish anything if you do that. No, usually when you listen to something, if you listen to any kind of resource, there will be keywords, there will be words that are repeated over and over again, and these are the words that you should focus on. So if you're listening to, say, a podcast or a Korean podcast about, I don't know, baseball, there are a few key phrases that relate to baseball.
Yagu.
Exactly.
Yagu
So this is what you want to focus on. If you can, write down the word's definition using simple Korean. It may not be possible in all cases, especially when you reach the intermediate level. It becomes helpful not to always rely on English for the translation. So focus on a few keywords and learn them well, and write those down.
And that leads us to our next sixth tip, which is, if you're able to, try slowing down the audio of whatever you're listening to. Sometimes when you're hearing things as a big cluster of sounds, when you're still a beginner and you're still learning sound change rules, it can be really overwhelming. But if you try slowing it down, you might find, oh, I actually know that grammar form. Oh, I actually did know that word there.
How much should we slow it down though? Because I think maybe instead of listening to like 100% speed, you may want to listen to like 75, even 50, but don't go any lower than
yeah, it'll sound like some
it wouldn't work.
The 7th tip that we have for you to improve your Korean listening is
you should always try to mix some audio content with video content. So if you're, for instance, only listen to podcasts, you should try sometimes also watching YouTube videos to try to mix it up a bit to make it more fun, make it more diverse. And they both had their distinct advantages and disadvantages. So first of all, of course, if you watch someone talking on a video, there is the good thing that you can see their expression. You can sort of see how they move their lips when they're talking.
You might get some context.
And you might get some context from their like facial expression and their gestures and the way that, like I'm gesturing with my hands right now. But when you listen to a podcast, you have to rely only on sound, which also frees up your energy for doing other things. So this is why I actually use podcasts quite a lot. I do it whenever I do the dishes, when I fold laundry, when I'm commuting, even when I work out sometimes. You don't have to pay too much attention to, obviously not when you're doing something, I don't know, performing surgery, whatever. I wouldn't do that. I don't perform surgery.
I would also recommend, and it's in the description, is Naver audio clips, is that right? Oh, audio clip Naver. In there, if you search for 공포 radio, so horror radio, I'm sure I've listened to those before. I'm listening to all of those. Another benefit of podcasts that we didn't mention is actually, while when you're watching a video, you get that extra context, so you know they're making expressions, you can see their lips. With radio, because you can't, it forces the people who are making those radio shows to speak much more clearly than they would if they were filming in video.
Right, and usually the audio quality may be better as well.
Yeah. The next and 8th tip we have is kind of related to that, but in addition to incorporating audio with video, also make sure to incorporate reading of some sort. Well, some people I've heard said that they only do reading. That's not going to work very well. Or that they never do any reading, and you're also missing out on a lot if you're not doing some sort of reading. Yeah,
whenever you're exposed to Korean, a lot of that Korean is going to be written. In order to become really fluent in Korean, become really good at it, you have to also become very comfortable reading Korean.
Things like signs.
Exactly.
Or if you're talking with your friends on a messenger app or anything.
Exactly. So one thing I like to do is whenever I watch Korean content, say on YouTube, sometimes there are Korean captions, and it's really nice because then you can listen and you can read, which is really good if there's a new word, say you haven't heard before, you're just like, oh, I wonder how that's spelled. It's right there in front of your eyes and you can easily look it up, and it makes it so much easier to also retain that word later, I find. But then wait, we're talking about reading, but the video is about listening comprehension. So how does this even connect? The reason is that all these disciplines when learning a language, they're sort of connected, right? Because like Billy just said, if you only ever focus on reading, you're not going to improve your Korean very much. And at the same time, if you only focus on listening, well, your listening skills may be improving, but your overall Korean skills may still be lacking. So it's important to incorporate this, because also when you read, you may expose yourself to new words that you don't know and that you will learn that way, and that will in turn help you understand Korean better. Really, it's all just part of language learning. Yeah, there could be many things that you'll find in reading very often, but you might not find too often in speaking. And I've had that as well. I'll see lots of expressions that I'll read and not necessarily hear so much, but then I hear it once and I'm like, oh, I know it. And I would not have learned that otherwise. Exactly. It's the same when you're reading a novel in English. I mean, there are a lot of words that people don't use on a day-to-day basis, but it still helps to know them if you want to become really good at English, right? So it's the same in Korean. Yeah, like those really long words we have in English or something that no one ever uses. That's very, very poetic. They might use it. Yeah, they might. Yeah. And then you know it, and then you're cool. What would you recommend people use for finding stuff to read then? Right, so one app that I've been using recently is an ebook app, or maybe even audiobook app, that's called Ready Books. So you can read on your phone or your tablet or wherever, and then you can have a voice read it out to you. It sort of serves a double purpose. Like someone reading along with you. Yeah, exactly. Someone reading along with you. Another thing we didn't mention is
Twitch, any day, anytime, you will find hundreds.
Yes.
I mean hundreds of people that are just talking Korean.
Yeah.
And they would love if you would stop by. There's so many people with 0 viewers or 1 viewer. Say hi in Korean, talk with them, they would love it. It would be great. I've done that. This is something I personally
No, but
do.
it's a fun way to interact, especially if you don't have any language partners, anyone you can speak Korean to. This is a fun way. Use the internet, use the resources.
And then the other last thing, which I also think is a lot of people skip over, is if you have a hobby, some sort of interest that you have that you would normally like to learn about, just search for it in Korean on YouTube.
One of my students actually is really into knitting.
Knitting?
Yeah, knew way more knitting vocabulary than I did. Because, I mean, I may not need knitting vocabulary because I don't really knit. But if that is your hobby, then of course that should be part of your everyday vocabulary.
This might be obvious, but I've seen lots of people who will say that they're doing listening practice and that they're no longer doing Korean study normally. This is not a substitute for regular learning. This is part of regular learning.
Exactly.
So yeah, definitely keep going with regular studying as well.
And keep mixing it up and keep having fun with it.
For our final 10th tip,
try shadowing. So when you're listening to something, if you feel comfortable with it, if you're home alone or you don't feel you're bothering anyone, try shadowing. Try saying out loud what you're listening to. You don't have to do it with every word or every sentence, but just once in a while, because sort of subconsciously you get to compare your own pronunciation to the native speaker's pronunciation. I did a lot of shadowing.
How would you do shadowing? Can you give me an example?
Oh, I would listen to a podcast, for example, maybe Talk to Me in Korean, one of their
they're talking to me in 100% Korean.
Yeah, 100% Korean.
Hey Hyunwoo.
Hi Hyunwoo. So maybe not all the voices, but I would maybe pick one of the persons and say, okay, whatever he or she says, I'm going to repeat that. So that's a really, really good way to improve your Korean, both your listening skills, because you have to really pay attention in order to be able to repeat what they said.
And you want to pick someone who has a similar voice style that you would want to copy also. So say I could pick Hyunwoo or someone like that. I probably wouldn't pick Yeji or Kyungwon or...
I would probably pick maybe Kyungwon or Chuyeon or one of the girls. Right.
Just for people who are new to shadowing, you play it once and you play, say, a sentence or so.
Yeah, so I would not usually start shadowing the first time that I listen. So this sort of goes back to the listening
multiple times.
Yeah, multiple times. So maybe the second or third time that I listen to the podcast, I would sort of pick out one person and I would just repeat everything that they say.
So you're kind of like role playing in that spot.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And try not only to follow their pronunciation, but also to follow their intonation. So if they're saying something that sort of shows, I don't know, surprise, I would try to also emulate that. And that's where it comes in so handy. Yeah.
And that's what I think is an easy way to tell someone's Korean level is how is their intonation? Are they saying things kind of like with a Korean intonation, or are they saying things like very flat, or worse, are they saying it just like their own native language?
Right. We're not saying that you by any means should sound like a native speaker, like completely flawless. Just be understandable and have a pronunciation, intonation that sounds, I want to say natural, natural to Koreans. But
like
Koreans,
your English is natural.
Thanks. I mean, I've been speaking English since I was very young, but it's not my native language. But I try not to have a pronunciation or intonation that sounds very, I don't know, odd or awkward, whatever. So yeah, that's what I'm saying. And this is what you should aim for in Korean.
That was our last tip. We don't have any more tips. So thank you for watching. Again, special thanks to my special guest, Special Sofie.
Special Sofie? You want to do that again?
No, that's good.
Okay. Thank you for having me. This was so much fun. 그럼 다음에 또 봐.
You remember what to say?
Of course.
그럼 다음에 또 봐.
Bye bye.